In the realm of fairy tales, few stories are as universally recognized as Cinderella. To the casual observer, it is a simple tale of kindness rewarded, hardship overcome, and love found against all odds. Children across the globe have grown up enchanted by the image of a lonely girl, mistreated by her stepmother and stepsisters, transformed by a magical benefactor, and ultimately reunited with her prince through a delicate glass slipper. Yet beneath the shimmering veneer of magic and romance lies a narrative far more complex, and disturbingly dark. The dark truth hidden in Cinderella's glass slipper is not merely a retelling of a beloved story. It is an unmasking of the societal, historical, and human realities that gave rise to the tale, and the subtle mechanisms of control and exploitation that it reflects. The glass slipper itself, long seen as a symbol of destiny and purity, carries a deeper significance that has been largely ignored. It is a token of objectification, a literal fitting of one individual into a rigid societal mold, and a metaphor for the pressures and limitations imposed on women throughout history. From its earliest oral origins in medieval Europe to its codification in the works of Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm, the story has been shaped by the cultural forces of class hierarchy, gender expectation, and social compliance. These layers of meaning, often sanitized or overlooked in modern adaptations, reveal a world where innocence is exploited, ambition is constrained, and survival depends upon conformity to arbitrary rules. This investigation will peel back the glittering layers of Cinderella's story, exploring the darker truths hidden beneath its familiar narrative. By examining historical context, symbolic imagery, and the cultural mechanisms of storytelling, we will uncover how a tale of magic and romance can serve as a mirror reflecting centuries of human suffering and societal control. What seems whimsical and innocent is, in fact, a tale born of harsh realities, and its glass slipper is far heavier than it appears. Long before Cinderella became the emblem of animated films, glittering glass slippers, and magical fairy godmothers, her story traveled across continents, shaped and reshaped by the cultures through which it passed. The origins of Cinderella are not confined to a single culture or author. Rather, they form a patchwork of narratives that stretch from ancient China to Greece and across medieval Europe. These earliest versions, far from the sanitized, comforting tales familiar to modern audiences, were embedded in societal realities of hierarchy, exploitation, and cruelty. They were stories that reflected, and often reinforced, the rigid structures of their times, showing that Cinderella's struggles were not purely fantastical but were emblematic of the human condition within oppressive systems. The earliest recorded version of Cinderella appears in the 9th century Chinese tale of Yi Xian. In this narrative, Yi Xian is a young girl mistreated by her stepmother, whose cruelty is relentless. She is denied basic comforts and forced to live in squalor, yet her inherent virtue attracts the intervention of a magical fish, a gift from her deceased mother. The fish aids her in attending a festival where she captivates the king, ultimately leading to her rescue from servitude. What is immediately striking in this version is the depiction of systemic oppression within the domestic sphere. The stepmother wields authority unchecked, manipulating social hierarchies and enforcing strict control over Yi Xian. While the magical intervention offers relief, it is not merely an act of whimsy. It reflects the desperate hope for external intervention in societies where individual agency, particularly for young women of lower status, was severely limited. In this sense, Yi Xian's story embodies both the dangers and possibilities inherent in historical social structures, a cautionary tale of vulnerability under domestic tyranny, framed within a fantastical narrative. Thousands of miles away, in ancient Greece, the story of Rhodopis emerges around the 1st century BCE. Here, the narrative features a Greek slave girl whose sandal is stolen by an eagle and delivered to the pharaoh of Egypt. This single act, seemingly magical, triggers the pharaoh's pursuit of the girl, elevating her from slavery to royalty. Yet beneath the veneer of enchantment lies a stark depiction of social disparity. Rhodopis is powerless within the structures that dominate her life. Her beauty and virtue are the only currencies that allow her social mobility. The tale emphasizes the arbitrary mechanisms of fortune and recognition, highlighting the precarious position of those at the margins of society. Slavery, social stratification, and the capriciousness of authority are central to this narrative, demonstrating that even early stories of Cinderella were grounded in realities of oppression and inequality rather than pure romantic fantasy. By the medieval period, the story had spread to Europe, where it evolved into numerous variants. One of the earliest European versions, found in Giambattista Basile's 17th-century collection Pentamerone, presents a much darker and more violent tale. The protagonist, named Zazzola, endures relentless mistreatment by her stepmother and stepsisters. The story does not shy away from the physical and emotional abuse inflicted upon her. Instead, it emphasizes suffering as a tool to illuminate virtue and moral endurance. The European versions increasingly highlighted the rigid hierarchies of class and family authority, where obedience and passivity were often necessary for survival. In these narratives, the magical interventions, whether through enchanted objects or supernatural benefactors, function less as whimsical amusements and more as symbolic commentaries on the limited avenues available for oppressed individuals to escape systemic injustice. The brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault would later codify these stories in the 19th century, providing the framework for the familiar Cinderella tale. However, even in these seemingly gentler versions, the original undertones of social stratification and cruelty remain visible. Perrault's French version, while softening some of the violence and introducing the emblematic glass slipper, still places emphasis on virtue and obedience as necessary qualities for social ascension. Cinderella's ascent is not merely about personal merit or love. It is intricately tied to her ability to navigate and ultimately be recognized by a hierarchical system that privileges wealth, beauty, and compliance. The glass slipper, in this context, is more than a romantic device. It is a symbol of societal fit, of conforming to the expectations and constraints imposed upon women and the lower classes. The persistence of these motifs across cultures and centuries reveals the universality of certain human experiences: oppression, inequality, and the precariousness of social mobility. In every version, Cinderella's suffering is not incidental. It is a mirror held up to the societal structures that enable and perpetuate cruelty. The narrative communicates the harsh reality that individual virtue alone was rarely sufficient to overcome systemic barriers, and that survival often required the intervention of external forces, be they magical or otherwise. Even the fantastical elements of these stories, from magical fish to birds delivering sandals, can be understood as symbolic representations of hope and the unpredictable nature of fate in hierarchical societies. Yet it is not merely the depiction of suffering that marks the historical origins of Cinderella as darker than modern renditions suggest. The story also conveys implicit lessons about compliance and social order. In many early versions, the heroine's reward is contingent upon her adherence to societal norms: kindness, humility, and patience in the face of injustice. Deviations from these norms are punished, often severely. The moral framework embedded within these tales reflects a world in which social structures are rigid, and survival and advancement are closely monitored by both familial and societal hierarchies. This underscores the notion that Cinderella's tale was not simply entertainment, but a narrative tool for transmitting cultural expectations and reinforcing existing power dynamics. Examining the origins of Cinderella, from Ysienne to Rhodopis and through European iterations, it becomes evident that the tale is far more than a simple story of triumph. It is a chronicle of oppression, a reflection of social hierarchies, and a meditation on the precariousness of human existence within rigidly structured societies. Each version, while culturally distinct, shares common threads of cruelty, inequality, and the limited agency of those marginalized by their social position. The narrative's endurance across centuries speaks to its deep resonance with fundamental human concerns: the desire for justice, the longing for recognition, and the tenuous hope for deliverance from circumstances beyond one's control. Thus, the origins of Cinderella illuminate a reality often obscured by modern adaptations. The story was never merely about magic or romance. It was about survival under oppression, the subtle mechanisms of social control, and the harsh consequences of hierarchical societies. The tale's endurance is a testament to its ability to encode these lessons within a compelling narrative, and it is only by understanding these origins that one can fully grasp the weight of what is hidden beneath the sparkling surface of the glass slipper. Through this lens, Cinderella emerges not as a passive figure waiting for rescue, but as a symbol of the struggle of the oppressed, navigating a world designed to confine and exploit her. As we transition from the early origins of Cinderella and the harsh realities they depict, the narrative leads inevitably to one of its most enduring and emblematic elements: the glass slipper. At first glance, the slipper appears to be a delicate, whimsical token, a magical object that connects the heroine to her destined fortune. Yet, a closer examination reveals that it is far more than a mere symbol of romance or purity. The glass slipper embodies fragility, societal control, and the objectification of women, serving as a tangible manifestation of the very hierarchies and pressures that define the lives of young women across centuries. Its symbolic resonance is both subtle and profound, reflecting not only cultural ideals of femininity, but also the dangers inherent in adhering to rigid societal expectations. Historically, the crafting of glass was a labor-intensive and specialized process, a technology that was costly and inaccessible to the majority of the population. Glassmaking required exceptional skill, precise temperature control, and expensive raw materials such as silica, soda, and lime. In medieval Europe, only the wealthy could afford glass objects of beauty, and even more so items designed for personal adornment or clothing. The slipper's very composition, therefore, signals an association with wealth and social status. In a society where shoes were not merely functional but markers of class and privilege, a transparent slipper would have been at once dazzling and impractical, highlighting the disparities between ordinary life and the aspirational fantasy offered by the tale. The slipper's fragility mirrors the precarious position of the heroine. A single misstep could shatter it, just as one transgression or deviation from societal expectations could jeopardize her standing and prospects. Beyond its material symbolism, the slipper functions as a tool of control. Its precise fit, a literal molding of one individual to a preordained form, represents the societal insistence that women conform to narrowly defined roles. In this way, the glass slipper is not simply an emblem of destiny, but a mechanism for measuring compliance. The story implicitly communicates that only those who adhere to prescribed ideals of beauty, virtue, and obedience will be recognized, rewarded, or elevated. Women's value, both within the narrative and historically, was often assessed through appearance and comportment, and the slipper becomes a physical embodiment of these expectations. By submitting to the measurement and the fitting, Cinderella, like countless real women across history, accepts the terms set by a patriarchal society in exchange for social mobility and recognition. The slipper also carries deeper implications regarding objectification and surveillance. Its transparency is a visual metaphor. Nothing is hidden, and every aspect of the wearer is on display. This notion parallels historical practices wherein women's behavior, clothing, and physical presence were constantly scrutinized and judged according to social norms. The glass slipper transforms Cinderella into an object of desire and evaluation. Her individuality is secondary to the symbolic function she serves. The story's tension, the prince searching for the one whose foot fits, underscores the conditional nature of recognition. Reward is contingent upon conformity, and deviation, no matter how minor, results in exclusion or punishment. In this sense, the slipper encapsulates a silent yet potent commentary on societal pressures, revealing how an ostensibly innocuous accessory can reinforce power dynamics and hierarchies. Footwear has long carried cultural and social significance. In historical Europe, shoes were markers of status, occupation, and propriety. Elaborate shoes, crafted from fine materials, signaled wealth and refinement, while simpler or worn footwear indicated lower social standing. The glass slipper, in its ethereal and fragile design, represents the pinnacle of this symbolic hierarchy, a luxury so impractical that it is both unattainable for most and emblematic of societal aspiration. Its fragility is also a warning. The slipper cannot withstand rough handling or carelessness, paralleling the delicate position of women navigating social hierarchies. It is a reward that is as perilous as it is desirable, reflecting the hidden dangers embedded within the pursuit of status and recognition. Moreover, the slipper can be interpreted as a metaphor for surveillance and control within the domestic sphere. In many early versions of the tale, Cinderella's home life is characterized by constant monitoring and restriction, with her stepmother exercising authority over her every action. The slipper extends this dynamic outward. It becomes the tool through which the prince exercises power, selecting the right individual based on a narrow and highly controlled criterion. Here, the magical object mirrors real-world mechanisms of social control, where women's opportunities and destinies were contingent upon approval from figures of authority, be they family members, patrons, or societal institutions. The narrative illustrates the intersection of beauty, virtue, and compliance as conditions for mobility and recognition, making the slipper an object that embodies both desire and danger. In addition, the slipper's association with magic and fate intensifies its symbolic weight. While it appears to offer a miraculous escape from oppression, it is inseparable from the social and material realities it represents. The intervention of magical forces does not negate the underlying hierarchies. It merely navigates them in a way that appears fantastical to the audience. The slipper's role is dual. It offers hope, yet it simultaneously reinforces the standards and limitations imposed on the heroine. The narrative implies that transcendence from suffering is conditional and contingent upon alignment with societal norms, a theme that resonates across centuries, reminding viewers that tales of liberation often carry hidden lessons about conformity, propriety, and the consequences of stepping outside prescribed boundaries. Even the slipper's delicate construction can be read as an emblem of vulnerability. Glass shatters easily, and its transparency exposes every flaw. Similarly, Cinderella's position in society is inherently fragile, dependent upon factors beyond her control. Her social ascent is contingent upon the recognition of her virtue and beauty, the intervention of external forces, and the precise measurement of her conformity to the ideal embodied by the slipper. One misstep could undo her progress, just as a slip or a crack would render the glass slipper useless. This fragility underscores the precariousness of women's positions historically. The rewards of virtue and compliance were never guaranteed, and the structures designed to elevate them were as fragile as they were exacting. While the glass slipper symbolizes societal control and the fragility of the heroine's position, the forces that enforce this control are most vividly embodied in the stepfamily. In modern retellings, the stepmother and stepsisters are often reduced to exaggerated caricatures, cruel, petty, and unreasonably jealous. However, historical context reveals a far more complex and unsettling reality. The oppression Cinderella experiences at the hands of her stepfamily is not merely a narrative convenience. It mirrors the lived experiences of countless young women subjected to domestic servitude, exploitation, and rigidly enforced hierarchies within patriarchal households. By examining the socio-economic and cultural forces at play, the story's seemingly whimsical cruelty emerges as a reflection of systemic abuse and social manipulation. In many historical societies, households were not only domestic spaces but also microcosms of societal hierarchies, with clearly defined roles and expectations. Stepfamilies were particularly fraught with tension, often arising from inheritance disputes or the blending of children from multiple marriages. Inheritance practices frequently favored biological children over stepchildren, creating an environment in which competition and resentment were institutionally reinforced. A stepmother's treatment of her stepchildren, particularly daughters, could therefore be influenced by economic self-interest as well as social norms, rather than mere personal malice. Cinderella's forced labor, denial of comfort, and subjugation to menial tasks reflect the structural pressures placed on young women in such households. Her story encapsulates the intersection of gender, age, and social position, highlighting the vulnerability of those who lacked paternal protection or status within the family hierarchy. Domestic labor in historical households was demanding and relentless, particularly for girls and young women of lower status. Tasks that appear innocuous in modern retellings, cleaning, cooking, tending to fires, and caring for animals, were, in reality, time-consuming, physically exhausting, and essential to the household's functioning. Girls like Cinderella were expected to perform these duties without recognition or reward, their labor taken for granted as a natural extension of their supposed obedience and virtue. The narrative exaggerates the cruelty of her stepfamily not simply for dramatic effect, but to illuminate the systemic exploitation of domestic workers and children within patriarchal societies. In this way, the fairy tale functions as both moral instruction and subtle social critique, revealing the harsh conditions endured by those trapped in the lowest rungs of domestic hierarchies. Child exploitation extended beyond physical labor to emotional manipulation and psychological control. Historical stepmothers often wielded their authority through intimidation, favoritism, and strategic humiliation. Cinderella's constant comparison to her stepsisters, her enforced invisibility within the household, and her denial of basic comforts echo real practices aimed at maintaining hierarchy and social conformity. Young women in these contexts were acutely aware that their value, and potential for marriage, social mobility, or inheritance, was contingent upon compliance and subordination. Fairy tales, with their layers of magic and fantasy, served to veil these realities, allowing stories to entertain while subtly reinforcing social norms. By framing oppression in the guise of narrative conflict, tales like Cinderella normalized the hardships faced by women, encoding lessons about obedience, patience, and virtue into enduring cultural narratives. The stepmother's role in particular illustrates a convergence of personal, social, and economic motivations. In a society where women's status and security were frequently tied to marriage and domestic authority, stepmothers were tasked with managing households, enforcing discipline, and safeguarding resources for their biological children. The systemic disadvantage of stepchildren, particularly daughters, created a context in which cruelty could be rationalized as necessity. Cinderella's subjugation, her relegation to the hearth, her forced labor, and her marginalization reflects these broader societal dynamics. The tale's depiction of the stepmother as both enforcer and gatekeeper underscores the ways in which patriarchal systems delegated control over vulnerable family members to intermediaries, often women themselves, perpetuating cycles of oppression. Equally significant are the stepsisters, whose actions extend beyond simple jealousy to illustrate the social reinforcement of hierarchy among peers. Their complicity highlights a key dynamic in patriarchal households. Competition and conformity were interlinked. By participating in the humiliation and exclusion of Cinderella, the stepsisters reinforce the societal expectation that survival and advancement depend upon adherence to hierarchical norms. In historical terms, this mirrors the ways in which young women were often pitted against each other, vying for limited resources, attention, or prospects, particularly within blended or extended families. The fairy tale exaggerates these behaviors for narrative clarity, yet the underlying reality remains consistent with documented experiences of domestic and familial strife in historical societies. Cinderella's suffering is further intensified by the imposition of labor as a marker of moral and social worth. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes her humility, diligence, and patience, framing her endurance as evidence of virtue. In historical households, these traits were often compulsory, with young women expected to demonstrate obedience and industriousness as prerequisites for marriage, inheritance, or social acceptance. Disobedience or resistance could provoke punishment or social exclusion, reinforcing a system in which power dynamics were strictly enforced. By presenting Cinderella's labor as both a source of suffering and a test of character, the tale mirrors real-world conditions in which domestic work was both exploitative and morally instructive, embedding lessons about submission, resilience, and social conformity within a framework of magical storytelling. The juxtaposition of fantasy and oppression in Cinderella's story serves an important narrative function. It softens the harsh realities of exploitation while simultaneously preserving their recognition. Magic, whether through the intervention of fairy godmothers, enchanted objects, or transformative events, provides the illusion of escape, yet does not erase the structural inequities at play. The stepmother's cruelty, the stepsisters' complicity, and the endless labor imposed upon Cinderella operate within an historical framework of exploitation that is recognizable to contemporary audiences familiar with historical practices of domestic servitude. The narrative's fantastical elements act as a lens through which viewers can apprehend the gravity of these conditions without being overwhelmed by their brutality, creating a layered storytelling technique that balances moral instruction, social critique, and entertainment. Cultural historians have noted that tales like Cinderella often functioned as vehicles for social commentary, encoding lessons about power, labor, and hierarchy in forms that were accessible and memorable. By framing systemic oppression within a familiar narrative, these stories ensured the transmission of social norms and expectations across generations. The heroine's suffering and ultimate reward communicate a subtle yet enduring message. Compliance with societal hierarchies is both necessary and morally righteous, while deviation can lead to punishment or marginalization. In this light, the tale's enduring appeal is inseparable from its portrayal of real historical conditions, including the exploitation of domestic labor, child subjugation, and the rigid enforcement of gendered norms. Moreover, the story emphasizes the role of observation and intervention by external authorities in determining the heroine's fate. While the stepfamily enforces the limitations of the household, it is the intervention of magical or socially powerful figures, the fairy godmother, the king, or the prince, that enables Cinderella to transcend her oppression. This mirrors historical dynamics in which social mobility for women, particularly those in servitude or marginalized positions, was contingent upon recognition or patronage from those with authority. The tale's magical veneer masks a deeply rooted reality. Opportunities for advancement were neither equitable nor guaranteed, and systemic barriers required extraordinary circumstances to overcome. Having explored the structural oppression embodied by Cinderella's stepfamily, the narrative naturally shifts to the figure who is often celebrated as her savior, the prince. Modern audiences perceive him as a romantic hero, a benevolent agent of destiny who rescues the protagonist from suffering and elevates her to a life of wealth and happiness. Yet, when examined through a historical lens, the prince emerges less as a symbol of altruistic love and more as a representative of systemic power, control, and social authority. His role underscores the transactional and hierarchical nature of relationships in historical societies, revealing that Cinderella's apparent liberation was often entwined with a loss of agency and the implicit expectation of compliance. The story's portrayal of romance masks a deeper reality in which power, status, and control dictated the terms of social mobility, marriage, and personal choice. In historical contexts, marriages among the upper classes were rarely matters of personal desire. They were frequently arranged for political alliances, the consolidation of wealth, or the maintenance of social hierarchy. Royal and noble families viewed marital unions as instruments for reinforcing dynastic interests, forging political bonds, and securing economic advantage. Within this framework, the prince's selection of a bride is not merely an act of personal preference or romantic destiny, but an exercise of authority within a rigidly structured system. Cinderella's elevation, framed in the tale as the reward for virtue and beauty, can also be understood as a form of social negotiation. Her compliance with societal ideals allows her to be integrated into a sphere of influence governed by transactional imperatives. The slipper functions as a mechanism of selection, ensuring that only those who conform to prescribed standards, appearance, comportment, and moral rectitude, are deemed suitable for advancement. From this perspective, the prince's role embodies both opportunity and constraint. He is the arbiter of Cinderella's fate, granting access to a higher social position while simultaneously defining the terms of that elevation. Her consent, rarely questioned in the narrative, is implicitly assumed to align with the desires and expectations of the ruling class. Historical records reveal that women in similar circumstances were often expected to acquiesce to unions arranged by fathers, guardians, or authorities, with limited capacity to exercise personal choice. The tale's romantic framing obscures the coercive undertones of this dynamic, presenting Cinderella's ascension as an act of liberation rather than a negotiated acceptance of existing power structures. In reality, social mobility frequently came at the cost of autonomy, with young women required to navigate complex hierarchies and expectations in order to secure security and status. The transactional nature of courtship and marriage in historical societies also highlights the symbolic significance of the glass slipper within the prince's role. The slipper is not merely a token of recognition or attraction, it is a tool of verification, a precise measure through which the prince exercises authority and enforces conformity. By requiring that the slipper fit perfectly, he determines who is eligible for integration into his social and political world. This act reinforces the broader societal principle that advancement, whether in marriage, social standing, or economic security, is contingent upon adherence to prescribed norms. The magical intervention may suggest whimsy, but the underlying logic mirrors historical mechanisms of control. Compliance and suitability, rather than personal affinity, dictate outcomes. The fairy tale thus disguises a structural reality, presenting what is essentially a socially mediated selection process as romantic destiny. Furthermore, the prince's role embodies the broader dynamics of male authority and societal oversight. His search for the wearer of the glass slipper is not simply a narrative device. It mirrors historical practices in which men in positions of power determined the fates of women within their spheres of influence. This surveillance and selection process reflects systemic control, ensuring that women's mobility and opportunities were circumscribed by societal approval. Cinderella's eventual recognition and elevation are contingent upon her ability to meet these externally defined standards, emphasizing that liberation within the story is conditional, not absolute. The narrative's magical veneer softens the coercive nature of this dynamic, but a careful historical reading reveals that the prince's rescue is inseparable from the exercise of hierarchical authority. The transactional aspects of the prince's role extend to the symbolic function of marriage as a form of social consolidation. By marrying Cinderella, the prince integrates her into an elite structure in which wealth, lineage, and political standing are tightly interwoven. Her personal qualities, virtue, patience, and beauty, serve as markers of suitability, ensuring that she can fulfill the expectations imposed by the institution of marriage and the broader courtly system. The fairy tale frames this union as romantic fulfillment, yet historically, such arrangements were designed to reinforce existing hierarchies rather than empower the individual. Cinderella's ascent is thus contingent upon compliance with societal ideals, illustrating that mobility and recognition are inseparable from the mechanisms of control that govern social order. It is also important to consider the limitations imposed on Cinderella's agency within this context. While the narrative emphasizes her eventual triumph, it rarely interrogates the conditions under which this triumph occurs. Historical analogues reveal that women elevated through marriage often found their autonomy constrained by familial, social, and political obligations. Their identities became bound to the expectations and authority of their spouses and households. In the fairy tale, Cinderella's magical transformation and eventual recognition obscure these constraints, creating the illusion of liberation. Yet, the underlying structure remains consistent with historical realities. Social elevation frequently required acquiescence, and personal choice was secondary to societal and political imperatives. The prince's intervention, while framed as an act of kindness and love, functions as an instrument of authority and social regulation, ensuring that the heroine's mobility is both sanctioned and controlled. Moreover, the prince's selective criteria reveal implicit cultural values. By seeking the perfect fit, he enforces a narrowly defined standard of acceptability, which extends beyond physical attributes to encompass moral virtue, demeanor, and conformity to societal ideals. Cinderella's ability to embody these qualities is central to her recognition, reinforcing the notion that social and political mobility was predicated on adherence to normative expectations. This dynamic underscores the broader theme of power and control inherent in the tale. The prince's role is not merely romantic but deeply enmeshed in the mechanisms of societal regulation, where recognition and reward are inseparable from compliance. The narrative's framing of the prince as a romantic hero also serves to obscure the coercive dimensions of social mobility. Cinderella's fate, while seemingly determined by chance or magic, is in fact shaped by systemic constraints and hierarchies. Her ascension depends on the intervention of an authority figure who wields the power to define suitability and dictate outcomes. The tale romanticizes this process, presenting it as a matter of destiny and love, but the historical reality suggests a more complex interplay of power, expectation, and conditional advancement. In this sense, the prince is less a savior and more a gatekeeper, enforcing social norms while facilitating the controlled elevation of individuals deemed acceptable within the hierarchy. As the narrative progresses from the prince's role as arbiter of power to the heroine's elevation, the setting of the ball emerges as a critical locus where societal hierarchy, surveillance, and spectacle converge. Modern audiences often perceive the ball as a celebratory event, a magical evening in which Cinderella's beauty captivates the prince and her dreams seemingly materialize. Yet, when examined through a historical lens, the ball assumes a far more complex function. It was not merely a social gathering, but a stage upon which social rules were enforced, alliances were observed, and hierarchies were both displayed and reinforced. The ball becomes a metaphorical cage, where participants navigate the tension between personal desire and systemic obligation, and Cinderella's entry into this arena exemplifies the delicate balance between agency, surveillance, and conformity. Historically, balls were key instruments of elite social life. From the courts of Renaissance Europe to the palaces of 18th-century France, they served as opportunities for rulers and nobles to consolidate power, observe subjects, and orchestrate social hierarchies. These gatherings were meticulously choreographed, with seating arrangements, introductions, and dances reflecting rigid social stratification. Every gesture, outfit, and movement was scrutinized, and deviation from accepted norms could signal impropriety or social inferiority. Within this context, the ball functioned as a site of surveillance. Individuals were evaluated for wealth, lineage, comportment, and appearance, much as Cinderella herself is measured by the slipper later in the narrative. Participation in such an event carried the dual burden of aspiration and exposure, highlighting the delicate interplay between desire for recognition and adherence to societal expectation. Cinderella's arrival at the ball, while framed as magical, underscores this tension. Her transformation, whether through fairy magic, enchanted garments, or temporary elevation, enables her entry into a space ordinarily closed to those of her social standing. Yet, her presence is not entirely liberating. It is contingent upon the suspension of ordinary rules and constant vigilance. She must navigate the gaze of the elite, maintain the appearance of perfection, and adhere to the prescribed behavioral scripts of courtly interaction. The spectacle of the ball emphasizes that even moments of apparent liberation are bounded by systemic constraints. One misstep or failure to conform could undo her temporary elevation. The narrative subtly conveys the precariousness of social mobility, demonstrating that visibility in elite circles was both an opportunity and a source of vulnerability. Beyond personal scrutiny, the ball operates as a mechanism for reinforcing social hierarchy. Guests were carefully positioned according to rank, family connections, and social standing, with dances, introductions, and proximity reflecting underlying power dynamics. In this sense, the ball is a performative exercise in both observation and display. Participants perform their roles while simultaneously assessing the status of others. Cinderella's participation in this spectacle highlights the intersection of visibility and evaluation. Her beauty and comportment attract attention, yet they are interpreted through the lens of social expectation. The magical transformation, while facilitating her entrance, does not alter the underlying structure. She is still subject to the rules and judgments imposed by those in positions of authority. The event's dual function as both entertainment and surveillance underscores the historical reality that elite gatherings were never neutral spaces. They were arenas in which power, control, and hierarchy were made tangible. Moreover, the ball functions as a metaphorical cage, encapsulating the tension between personal desire and systemic expectation. Cinderella's longing for recognition, connection, or escape is mediated by rules that dictate behavior, appearance, and interaction. Her joy and potential liberation are contingent upon her ability to navigate these constraints successfully. This mirrors historical experiences of women and lower-class participants in elite gatherings, who often found themselves performing within restrictive social frameworks, their movements and choices carefully circumscribed. The narrative captures this tension through the symbolic architecture of the ball. The grandeur, the choreography, and the watchful eyes of attendees serve as constant reminders that participation is conditional, provisional, and fraught with risk. The event also functions as a microcosm of broader societal dynamics, emphasizing observation and selective recognition. Just as the prince evaluates Cinderella's suitability as a bride, the broader social milieu assesses the behaviors and attributes of all participants. Balls were venues for matchmaking, alliance building, and social negotiation, where appearances and conduct were scrutinized for compatibility with existing hierarchies. Cinderella's entry into this space, therefore, exemplifies the historical reality that moments of social mobility were carefully monitored and regulated. Her fleeting success within this environment illustrates the precarious nature of opportunity in societies governed by strict rules and expectations. Recognition is conditional, and advancement is both a reward for compliance and a measure of systemic control. The spectacle of the ball extends beyond surveillance to the subtle orchestration of desire and obligation. Guests were expected to balance personal inclination with public duty, managing appearances, conversations, and interactions to conform to elite norms. Cinderella's participation embodies this duality. Her desire to experience joy and social connection intersects with the obligation to navigate scrutiny, maintain propriety, and adhere to the performative expectations imposed upon her. The narrative dramatizes this balance, portraying her temporary triumph as both exhilarating and perilous. Historical parallels abound. Women in patriarchal societies frequently had to negotiate similar tensions, navigating limited agency within spaces dominated by observation, evaluation, and implicit coercion. Furthermore, the ball reinforces the narrative logic of magical intervention juxtaposed with structural constraint. Cinderella's enchantment allows her to transcend ordinary limitations temporarily, yet the eventual requirement that she depart by midnight signals the persistence of boundaries and systemic control. This temporal limitation emphasizes that social mobility and visibility are not absolute. They are conditional, provisional, and circumscribed by external forces. The story thereby encodes an enduring truth about hierarchical societies. Moments of opportunity are rarely permanent and often require compliance, careful navigation, and awareness of surveillance. The ball crystallizes these dynamics, rendering visible the interplay between desire, power, and control that shapes the heroine's journey. In analyzing the ball's historical function, it becomes evident that this celebrated scene is more than a festive interlude. It is a concentrated expression of societal rules, hierarchies, and power relations, wherein every participant's actions, attire, and comportment are observed and judged. Cinderella's participation highlights the duality of opportunity and exposure, demonstrating that even seemingly liberating moments are tightly constrained by systemic expectations. The spectacle underscores that visibility within elite circles comes with both privilege and risk, and that advancement is inseparable from compliance with externally imposed norms. Following the spectacle of the ball, the narrative of Cinderella shifts toward the most visually enchanting and culturally memorable aspect of the tale, the magical transformation. Modern audiences are captivated by the fairy godmother's intervention, the instantaneous change of rags into sumptuous gowns, and the carriage that appears to whisk the heroine into a world of elegance and opportunity. Yet, when examined within historical and symbolic frameworks, these elements reveal layers of social commentary far deeper than their surface enchantment suggests. The transformative magic is not simply a fantastical reward for virtue. It is a narrative device that masks systemic injustice, illustrates the precarious nature of social mobility, and symbolizes the illusions of opportunity often offered to marginalized individuals. The figure of the fairy godmother is central to this interpretive lens. She functions as an external agent who temporarily suspends the rules imposed by social hierarchies, creating the possibility of elevation that would otherwise be inaccessible. Historically, however, such interventions were rare and contingent upon patronage, wealth, or favor from those in power. The magical helper embodies this dynamic, representing the notion that external validation is necessary for social recognition and advancement. Cinderella's transformation is contingent, temporary, and externally imposed, reinforcing the principle that those born into marginalization or subjugation could rarely achieve social mobility through personal merit alone. The fairy godmother's magic is a metaphor for social manipulation, an illusion of empowerment granted by authority rather than a genuine restructuring of inequitable systems. Disguise and deception, manifested in the transformative gown and the temporary concealment of Cinderella's lowly status, highlight the story's engagement with perception and social performance. In historical societies, visual presentation and the ability to perform appropriate social behaviors were crucial determinants of one's standing. Clothing, demeanor, and comportment signaled class, virtue, and suitability for inclusion within elite circles. Cinderella's magical disguise enables her to navigate spaces from which she is ordinarily barred, yet her success is dependent upon sustaining the illusion. The narrative dramatizes this precarious balance, emphasizing that social opportunity is often conditional and requires strategic conformity. The magic provides a brief window for Cinderella to experience recognition, but it does not challenge or dismantle the underlying structures that created her marginalization. The temporal limitation of the magic, the requirement that Cinderella return before midnight, is symbolic of the fleeting nature of such opportunities. Historically, marginalized individuals could occasionally gain access to privileges, resources, or recognition, but these moments were seldom permanent or unmediated. The imposition of a time limit reflects the fragility of such opportunities, illustrating that societal advancement was not a linear or guaranteed process. The narrative uses this element to heighten dramatic tension, but its historical resonance lies in the reminder that access to privilege is frequently provisional, contingent upon external factors, and fraught with the risk of exposure or reversal. Cinderella's disappearance at midnight signals the return of systemic constraints, underscoring that true liberation requires structural change rather than temporary intervention. The magical elements also function as metaphors for social illusions. They suggest that transformation, elevation, and recognition are attainable through virtue, beauty, or external favor, creating a narrative of hope that is alluring but ultimately mediated by societal norms. In historical terms, this mirrors the limited avenues available to those on the margins. Advancement required not only personal compliance but also visibility to those who could sanction upward mobility. The magic conceals the structural barriers, offering the appearance of opportunity while leaving the underlying inequities intact. In this sense, the fairy godmother's intervention is less a symbol of empowerment than a reflection of the mechanisms by which authority and privilege maintain control, using selective reward and spectacle to sustain compliance. Disguise, moreover, serves as a form of social negotiation within the narrative. Cinderella must adopt an identity acceptable to the elite audience of the ball, masking her laboring, subjugated self beneath the veneer of wealth and refinement. This mirrors historical strategies employed by marginalized individuals, particularly women, who navigated societal constraints by presenting themselves in ways that conformed to prevailing expectations. Clothing, etiquette, and comportment functioned as tools for negotiation, signaling compliance while attempting to leverage limited opportunities. The magical transformation amplifies this dynamic to fantastical proportions, but its symbolic meaning remains consistent. Social recognition is rarely unconditional and often requires the temporary adoption of an externally validated identity. Furthermore, the magical interventions underscore the tension between hope and systemic limitation. Cinderella experiences a momentary elevation that promises escape from oppression, yet the return to her original circumstances is inevitable once the magic fades. The story thus reflects a recurring historical reality. Marginalized individuals often encounter transient opportunities or external aid that alleviate immediate suffering but do not resolve structural inequalities. Magic, in this context, serves as a metaphor for these ephemeral interventions, highlighting the contrast between perception and reality, hope and constraint. The narrative dramatizes this tension, allowing audiences to experience triumph while subtly reinforcing the conditionality and precariousness of social mobility. The role of deception extends to the broader narrative, where appearances are constantly evaluated and judged by those in positions of power. The prince's recognition of Cinderella relies on her external transformation rather than her intrinsic qualities, mirroring historical practices in which value was assessed through performative markers such as appearance, comportment, and adherence to social norms. The magical disguise makes her legible to the elite, allowing her to navigate spaces normally inaccessible, yet it simultaneously underscores her dependence on external validation. Her personal qualities, while essential to the narrative's moral arc, are insufficient to secure recognition without the intervention that renders her visible and acceptable. This dynamic illuminates the interplay between systemic authority, opportunity, and individual merit, revealing the subtle ways in which fairy tales encode social realities within seemingly whimsical plots. Magical intervention also functions as a narrative device that reconciles the tension between oppression and reward. Cinderella's suffering, imposed by the stepfamily and reinforced by societal hierarchies, is temporarily mitigated through enchantment, providing audiences with a sense of justice and gratification. Yet this resolution is partial and contingent, emphasizing the illusory nature of empowerment under structural constraint. The fairy godmother's magic does not alter the distribution of power within the household or society. It merely creates a temporary window for recognition and reward. This mirrors historical conditions, wherein marginalized individuals occasionally received aid or patronage that alleviated immediate hardship but did not dismantle the systemic mechanisms that produced inequality. The narrative captures this paradox, offering the thrill of transformation while preserving the underlying social commentary. The magical elements also underscore the importance of timing and circumstance in navigating hierarchical systems. Cinderella's opportunity is precisely orchestrated, contingent upon the intervention of external authority and her ability to conform to expectations for a limited duration. This mirrors historical realities, where success or recognition often depended upon fortunate encounters, patronage, or alignment with institutional norms. The story dramatizes this contingency through magical intervention, but the underlying logic reflects real-world dynamics. Opportunity is rarely self-generated and frequently comes with constraints that limit autonomy and agency. Following the magical transformations and the temporary liberation afforded by the fairy godmother, the narrative of Cinderella reaches its most iconic and symbolically charged moment, the glass slipper trial. In modern retellings, this is often portrayed as a quaint, almost romanticized scene in which the prince searches for the mysterious woman he danced with, measuring her foot with precision until the slipper fits. Yet, when examined in historical and socio-cultural context, the scene reveals a far darker undertone, one rife with themes of obsession, surveillance, coercion, and the invasive scrutiny of women's bodies. The glass slipper, far from being a benign token of love or recognition, becomes an instrument through which systemic control, objectification, and verification are enacted, transforming what appears to be a moment of reunion into a subtle but profound exercise of power. At the heart of the slipper trial is the theme of obsessive surveillance. The prince, representing the authority of courtly or patriarchal power, undertakes a meticulous search across his kingdom, leaving no household unexamined. In historical societies, such exhaustive observation was not uncommon among those wielding social or political power. Monarchs and aristocrats maintained strict oversight over marriages, inheritance claims, and the movement of subjects, especially women, whose reproductive potential, lineage, and virtue were considered matters of public concern and dynastic significance. The glass slipper operates as a tool of this scrutiny. Every woman is required to present herself for evaluation, subjected to measurement and verification according to criteria established externally. This scene underscores the invasive nature of societal oversight, revealing the story's implicit commentary on female vulnerability and the mechanisms of control that historically constrained women's lives. The slipper trial also functions as a narrative representation of proof and verification, central concerns in hierarchical societies. Throughout history, tangible evidence was often demanded to establish identity, inheritance rights, or eligibility for marriage, particularly in contexts where social mobility or property transfer was at stake. In this sense, the glass slipper operates as both a literal and metaphorical instrument of verification. Cinderella's identity, virtue, and suitability are assessed through the precise fit of the shoe, reflecting historical practices in which women were measured, evaluated, and sanctioned according to rigid standards. This process, while rendered fantastical in fairy tales, mirrors real societal dynamics in which women's bodies became sites of documentation, scrutiny, and judgment, highlighting the slipper's latent coercive power. The obsessive nature of the search is also emblematic of the broader societal fixation on women's conformity to prescribed ideals. By demanding that every foot be tested until the perfect match is found, the narrative enacts a system in which deviation is impermissible and compliance is rigorously enforced. The slipper is not simply a means of recognition but an instrument of control. The wearer's body must conform exactly to external expectations. In historical terms, this mirrors practices of evaluating women's appearance, behavior, and social presentation to determine their worthiness for marriage, inheritance, or inclusion within elite circles. The fairy tale dramatizes these evaluations in a visually striking and symbolically potent manner, but the underlying logic remains rooted in surveillance, hierarchy, and the objectification of women. Violence, both symbolic and real, is embedded within this scrutiny. While the story does not depict physical harm in the fitting process, the slipper trial embodies a form of structural violence. Cinderella's vulnerability is laid bare as she is measured and tested, her body subjected to external authority in a manner that is invasive and objectifying. Historical parallels abound. Women's bodies have long been regulated through social, legal, and medical practices, with control exercised through clothing, behavioral expectations, and bodily examinations. The slipper functions similarly, concentrating themes of vulnerability and coercion within a single, iconic act. It is an emblem of the delicate balance between reward and subjugation, illustrating how recognition and social mobility are often conditional upon the submission of the body to the gaze and authority of others. Obsession, both personal and systemic, underscores the trial's intensity. The prince's relentless pursuit transforms a personal preference into a kingdom-wide mandate, compelling participation and compliance from countless households and women. In historical societies, marriages among elites were rarely matters of individual choice. They were enforced, orchestrated, and mediated according to political, economic, and social imperatives. The slipper trial encapsulates this dynamic by dramatizing the externalization of choice. Women do not present themselves voluntarily as equals, but are subjected to evaluation, measurement, and judgment by a figure of authority. The narrative thus encodes a powerful lesson about the imbalanced distribution of power and the latent coercion that can underlie seemingly romantic encounters. Furthermore, the slipper trial emphasizes the objectification inherent in systems of social verification. Cinderella's individual qualities, her intelligence, kindness, and resilience, are largely irrelevant to the trial, What matters is the physical conformity of her foot to the preordained criteria. This mirrors historical practices in which women's value was often assessed through appearance, physical attributes, or ability to conform to societal expectations. The fairy tale, in its fantastical form, crystallizes this process, allowing audiences to recognize the tensions between individuality and systemic control, between personal merit and externally imposed standards. In this light, the slipper is simultaneously a symbol of desire and a tool of surveillance, capturing the duality of recognition and coercion that has historically defined women's positions within hierarchies. The trial also engages with the theme of invasive authority, wherein power is exercised through meticulous examination and insistence on compliance. The prince's actions, though narratively romanticized, exemplify the historical principle that those in positions of authority maintain control by evaluating and codifying behavior, appearances, and suitability. Every home visited, every foot measured, reinforces the reach of systemic power, illustrating that Cinderella's recognition is not simply a matter of merit but of submission to a process she does not fully control. The narrative thus subtly critiques the structures of power that underlie social mobility, presenting a scene that is superficially celebratory while simultaneously reflecting enduring dynamics of observation, coercion, and regulation. The slipper trial's narrative tension also derives from the uncertainty and precariousness inherent in evaluation. Cinderella's fate hinges entirely upon the fit of a fragile, delicate object. This mirrors the fragility of historical opportunities for marginalized women, whose access to social recognition, economic security, or advantageous marriage often depended upon narrow, externally defined criteria. The slipper's fragility amplifies the stakes of the trial, emphasizing the vulnerability of the individual subjected to systemic scrutiny. One misalignment or perceived deviation could result in exclusion or denial, reinforcing the precariousness of advancement under hierarchical systems and the potential consequences of failing to conform. Symbolically, the trial also illustrates the intersection of desire and domination. The prince's desire, framed as romantic pursuit, operates in tandem with the mechanisms of systemic control. The act of searching, measuring, and identifying transforms the pursuit of affection into an exercise of authority and regulation. Cinderella, despite her virtues, occupies a position of subordination. Recognition and reward are contingent upon the precise alignment of her body and identity with the externally imposed criteria of suitability. In historical terms, this duality reflects the tension between personal aspiration and structural limitation, highlighting the ways in which hierarchical systems often frame opportunities as both desirable and coercive. The slipper itself emerges as a concentrated emblem of these dynamics. Transparent, fragile, and exacting, it embodies the ideals, constraints, and scrutiny imposed upon women. Its measurement functions as both reward and test, acknowledgement and surveillance, desire and control. The trial, when viewed through a historical lens, is a microcosm of systemic power structures in which women's bodies and actions are monitored, evaluated, and regulated. The narrative dramatizes these tensions, rendering visible the underlying logic of coercion, conformity, and the precarious nature of social mobility. Having examined the glass slipper trial as a site of surveillance, coercion, and objectification, the narrative of Cinderella proceeds to its celebrated conclusion, the so-called happily ever after. Popular retellings frame this moment as the heroine's ultimate liberation, a triumphant ascent from oppression into a life of wealth, recognition, and romantic fulfillment. Yet, when analyzed in historical and cultural context, this conclusion reveals a far more complex reality. Cinderella's elevation, while superficially celebratory, often functions less as a genuine act of freedom than as a continuation of systemic constraints under a different guise. Her rescue may reinforce cycles of dependency, social conformity, and limited agency, reflecting historical patterns in which the apparent empowerment of women was frequently mediated and circumscribed by prevailing hierarchies. In many historical societies, women's social and economic security was closely tied to marriage, particularly to men of higher social standing. Marriage functioned as a mechanism of control, structuring women's access to resources, status, and protection while simultaneously enforcing dependence. Cinderella's union with the prince exemplifies this dynamic. Her ascension is contingent upon her compliance with the norms, expectations, and authority of the court. While she experiences increased comfort, visibility, and security, these gains are inextricably linked to her subordination within a social hierarchy dictated by patriarchal power. Her happiness is thus conditional, framed by external approval rather than intrinsic autonomy, illustrating that liberation in such narratives often entails the substitution of one form of control for another. The so-called happily ever after also reinforces social conformity. Cinderella's reward is not simply the alleviation of suffering, it is her integration into a system that imposes expectations of behavior, virtue, and presentation. The narrative emphasizes her goodness, patience, and obedience, traits that align with the ideals valued by the ruling class, suggesting that recognition and reward are contingent upon continued compliance. Historical parallels abound. Women elevated through marriage or patronage were often expected to perform roles prescribed by their social positions, regulating their speech, demeanor, and appearance to conform to societal norms. In this sense, the story's conclusion perpetuates a cycle in which social mobility is granted not through personal empowerment but through alignment with externally imposed standards of propriety. Cinderella's rescue also illustrates the persistence of dependency. Throughout the tale, her circumstances are defined by reliance on external agents, the fairy godmother, the prince, and the broader social system. Her labor and suffering under her stepfamily, while removed by the narrative's resolution, are replaced by new forms of dependency on the prince and the structures of the court. This mirrors historical realities, where women's access to security, recognition, and resources often depended upon the favor or authority of male figures or institutional structures. The narrative frames these dependencies as positive and transformative, yet the underlying logic remains one of conditional elevation rather than true liberation. Cinderella's life of comfort is mediated by the continued oversight and approval of authority, emphasizing that her social mobility does not equate to complete autonomy. Moreover, the story's ending obscures the structural inequities that created Cinderella's vulnerability in the first place. Her ascension is presented as the resolution of personal hardship, but the systemic factors, patriarchal authority, inheritance practices, and societal expectations that facilitated her subjugation remain unchallenged. Historical context demonstrates that women's rescue often reinforced existing hierarchies rather than dismantling them, offering temporary relief while preserving the mechanisms of control. The narrative, by focusing on individual triumph, masks the broader social dynamics that govern opportunity, reward, and compliance. Cinderella's integration into the court exemplifies this tension. While her material conditions improve, the societal framework that enforces gendered dependency and hierarchical authority remains intact. The story also highlights the limits of personal agency within the framework of so-called liberation. Cinderella's ascent is predicated upon adherence to prescribed virtues, beauty, patience, humility, and obedience, which align her with the expectations of those in positions of authority. Her freedom is therefore defined not by self-determination but by conformity. In historical societies, similar patterns prevailed. Women could achieve recognition or security, but only through compliance with social norms and the validation of those who controlled resources, power, or status. The narrative frames this compliance as a moral virtue, obscuring the structural limitations placed upon autonomy. Happily Ever After becomes less a story of liberation and more a story of managed recognition, in which the heroine is rewarded for fitting into the very system that produced her marginalization. The illusion of choice is particularly salient. Cinderella's narrative trajectory suggests that her virtue and perseverance naturally lead to elevation and fulfillment, yet her outcomes are tightly constrained by external factors. The magical intervention, the prince's selection, and the systemic structures of recognition and reward. Historical parallels are clear. Women's opportunities were frequently shaped by chance, patronage, or approval from figures of authority, rather than purely personal merit. The story dramatizes this conditionality through enchantment and spectacle, yet the underlying lesson aligns with historical realities. Freedom, security, and social mobility are often mediated by compliance and the favor of those who control power. The narrative thus perpetuates the notion that personal fulfillment is contingent, dependent upon navigating pre-existing hierarchies rather than transforming them. Furthermore, the conclusion reinforces the objectification and surveillance initiated by the glass slipper trial. Cinderella's identity, visibility, and social value are defined by the approval of the prince and the court. Her body and comportment remain central to her recognition and inclusion. Historical analogues abound. Women's social standing has historically been evaluated through appearance, behavior, and perceived virtue, with advancement contingent upon conformity to external standards. Cinderella's happily ever after thus represents a continuation of this dynamic. While she is rewarded materially and socially, she remains within a framework in which her identity and autonomy are closely monitored and constrained. Liberation, in this sense, is both conditional and symbolic rather than absolute. The narrative also illustrates the persistence of structural power in defining relationships. Cinderella's union with the prince is celebrated as a romantic ideal, yet it is inseparable from the social hierarchies and gendered expectations that shaped her earlier subjugation. Her comfort, recognition, and security are granted not through dismantling patriarchal authority, but through integration into its highest echelons. Historical cases demonstrate that such rescues frequently perpetuated existing power structures. Women married into wealth or status often found their lives shaped by the expectations, oversight, and authority of husbands, families, and societal institutions. The fairy tale, while dramatizing personal triumph, subtly mirrors these historical patterns, suggesting that liberation can be illusory when measured against systemic constraints. Cinderella's narrative closure also emphasizes the conditionality of happiness and the performative nature of social reward. Her elevation is contingent upon her alignment with preordained virtues, the magical intercession of external agents, and the prince's judgment. These conditions reflect historical realities in which women's access to security, recognition, and opportunity depended upon compliance, performance, and visibility within hierarchical systems. The story's happy ending is thus both aspirational and constrained, offering an alluring narrative of triumph, while simultaneously reinforcing the social structures that circumscribe autonomy and agency. Finally, the tale's conclusion invites reflection on the broader cultural implications of its resolution. By presenting Cinderella's ascent as the ultimate form of liberation, the narrative naturalizes the notion that women's security and fulfillment are dependent upon external validation and integration into existing hierarchies. The story obscures the systemic inequities that underlie oppression, offering individual reward while leaving structural dynamics intact. In historical context, such narratives have functioned as tools for socialization, reinforcing compliance, patience, and conformity as pathways to recognition rather than challenging the frameworks that produce marginalization. Cinderella's happily ever after is therefore emblematic of the tension between perceived liberation and structural constraint, illustrating the complex interplay between personal triumph, societal expectation, and the enduring limitations imposed by hierarchical authority. Transitioning from the historical and systemic analysis of Cinderella's narrative, we arrive at the contemporary cultural landscape, where the tale has been reshaped, repackaged, and largely sanitized. Modern adaptations, most notably those produced by Disney, have transformed Cinderella into a symbol of cheerful perseverance, magic-induced triumph, and romantic fulfillment. These reinterpretations, while visually enchanting and widely celebrated, significantly obscure the darker realities embedded in the story's origins. The systemic oppression, coercion, and conditional liberation we have explored are replaced by simplified morality, whimsical magic, and a narrative of individual merit leading inevitably to reward. The result is a cultural artifact that entertains while simultaneously reshaping collective memory, diminishing the historical lessons and ethical complexities that the original narratives conveyed. Disney's 1950 animated adaptation, in particular, exemplifies this sanitization. The stepsisters are rendered comically cruel, the stepmother is villainized in broad strokes, and Cinderella's suffering is minimized to melodrama rather than portrayed as the reflection of systemic exploitation. The fairy godmother is introduced as a benevolent, almost maternal figure who resolves Cinderella's plight with magic, obscuring the conditionality and external mediation of her social mobility. The slipper is transformed from an instrument of surveillance and coercion into a charming plot device, and the prince is depicted as a romantic ideal rather than an arbiter of structural power. The narrative simplifies complex social dynamics into a tidy moral lesson. Kindness, patience, and beauty are rewarded, and evil is punished. While appealing to mass audiences, this framing erases the historical and systemic truths of oppression, surveillance, and social control that underlie the original tale. The cultural consequences of this sanitization are profound. By presenting a version of Cinderella in which social advancement is solely a matter of virtue and magical intervention, modern adaptations obscure the role of hierarchy, coercion, and dependency in shaping opportunities. Audiences, particularly young viewers, internalize a vision of society in which merit and goodness are sufficient to overcome structural barriers, ignoring the historical realities that limited agency, imposed compliance, and constrained women's lives. This framing can shape perceptions of gender roles, reinforcing ideals of passivity, patience, and moral compliance as pathways to success. It also simplifies complex class dynamics, presenting social mobility as a magical reward rather than a negotiated and conditional process dependent upon power, surveillance, and systemic structures. Furthermore, the narrative shift in modern adaptations reframes morality in binary terms. In historical versions, the consequences of oppression and subjugation were not merely punitive or corrective, they reflected enduring social hierarchies and systemic injustice. Evil was often institutional as much as personal, with cruelty and exploitation rooted in material conditions, inheritance practices, and gendered authority. Disney's adaptation, however, reduces this complexity to individual villainy versus virtue, substituting nuanced social critique with a moral tale centered on personal reward. This simplification has consequences for cultural understanding. It encourages the perception that societal inequities are the result of individual failings rather than embedded structural forces, thus obscuring the lessons the original story could impart regarding systemic oppression. The erasure of darker elements also affects perceptions of agency and consent. In modern adaptations, Cinderella is celebrated for her patience, grace, and eventual triumph, while the transactional and coercive aspects of marriage and recognition are minimized or removed. The prince's role as a figure of authority and control is recast as romantic pursuit, and the glass slipper is framed as an innocuous token of destiny rather than an instrument of invasive evaluation. This reframing reinforces the cultural idea that success and liberation are straightforward and personal, rather than mediated by external authority or structured hierarchies. It also perpetuates a vision of romantic relationships in which agency, consent, and power dynamics are obscured, reinforcing the myth of the benevolent savior rather than acknowledging the complexities of historical social negotiation. Beyond gender and agency, the sanitization of Cinderella also obscures class and labor dynamics. The heroine's position as a laboring, subjugated figure is downplayed, and her hardships are reframed as melodrama or comic inconvenience. In doing so, adaptations erase the historical reality that her subjugation reflected broader societal hierarchies, inheritance laws, and patriarchal authority. The labor she endured, once central to understanding her vulnerability and marginalization, becomes a narrative device for highlighting her virtue rather than a commentary on systemic exploitation. Modern storytelling thus diminishes the social critique embedded in the tale, replacing it with individualized moral lessons that resonate emotionally but obscure historical truths. Cultural impact extends further through the widespread dissemination of these sanitized narratives. The Disney adaptation and its numerous reimaginings, live-action films, merchandising, television spin-offs, have entrenched a singular vision of Cinderella in the global imagination. This dominant narrative frames the story as a tale of personal perseverance rewarded by magical intervention, marginalizing alternative interpretations and original versions that reflect the darker, historically grounded realities. As a result, audiences are less exposed to the historical context, systemic critique, and ethical complexity present in early versions such as Yi Xian, Rhodopis, or the Brothers Grimm's variants. The widespread acceptance of the sanitized narrative effectively reshapes cultural memory, privileging entertainment over historical consciousness. The tension between mythic storytelling and historical reality becomes particularly evident when considering the implications for social and moral understanding. Fairy tales have traditionally served as vehicles for complex lessons about morality, hierarchy, and human behavior. In the case of Cinderella, early narratives communicated subtle critiques of power, exploitation, and social regulation. Modern adaptations, by contrast, prioritize narrative clarity, visual spectacle, and emotional satisfaction, often at the cost of these instructive complexities. This tension illustrates a broader cultural phenomenon. The desire for palatable, optimistic storytelling can lead to the erasure of historical and ethical nuance, leaving audiences with emotionally resonant narratives that obscure the structural forces shaping human experience. Moreover, sanitized adaptations shape intergenerational perceptions of gender, class, and morality. By presenting Cinderella's success as a function of virtue, patience, and passive endurance, the story reinforces cultural expectations for women's behavior, subtly encouraging compliance and acceptance of authority as prerequisites for reward. Similarly, the narrative obscures the systemic nature of inequality, suggesting that merit alone can secure upward mobility and security. In doing so, modern adaptations risk cultivating an understanding of society that undervalues structural critique, minimizes the complexity of oppression, and prioritizes individual triumph over collective or systemic awareness. The erasure of dark elements also impacts the interpretation of desire, power, and social negotiation. Original narratives situate Cinderella's journey within a context of surveillance, coercion, and conditional recognition, providing insight into historical dynamics of gender and hierarchy. Modern adaptations recast these dynamics as magical romance, stripping away the layers of negotiation, vulnerability, and systemic constraint that give the story its historical depth. The result is a narrative that is emotionally satisfying but culturally flattened, presenting liberation as immediate, magical, and unproblematic rather than mediated by social reality. This transformation has profound implications for how society internalizes lessons about power, agency, and structural inequality. As we arrive at the conclusion of this investigation into Cinderella, it becomes evident that the story, long celebrated as a tale of virtue rewarded and magic-induced triumph, conceals a far darker reality. Across its historical origins, from the Chinese Yi Xian to the Greek Rhodopis and the European iterations collected by the Brothers Grimm, the narrative reflects systemic oppression, social hierarchy, and mechanisms of control. While modern retellings have transformed the tale into a sanitized, emotionally satisfying narrative of personal perseverance and romantic fulfillment, a careful examination of the story's elements reveals enduring themes of coercion, surveillance, and gendered vulnerability. By revisiting the tale through the lens of history, sociology, and cultural analysis, we uncover a story that communicates far more than whimsical adventure. It encodes lessons about power, compliance, and the fragile nature of opportunity within a stratified society. Central to this analysis is the figure of the glass slipper, which, beyond its romantic and magical associations, functions as a symbol of fragility, control, and systemic coercion. In the narrative, the slipper's delicate transparency conceals the intensity of surveillance and evaluation it represents. Cinderella's identity, worth, and access to opportunity are mediated through the measurement of this object, highlighting the conditionality of recognition and the vulnerability of those subject to external authority. Historical parallels reinforce this reading. Women's lives have often been shaped by externally imposed standards, whether in courtship, inheritance, or social standing, with compliance and conformity serving as prerequisites for advancement. The slipper crystallizes this dynamic, rendering visible the subtle mechanisms by which social hierarchies regulate bodies, behavior, and mobility. The story's exploration of oppression begins with Cinderella's domestic environment, where the stepmother and stepsisters enforce labor, subjugation, and social marginalization. Far from mere caricature, these characters reflect the historical realities of patriarchal households in which young women were often exploited for labor and denied economic or social autonomy. The tale encodes these experiences through the lens of fantasy, disguising cruelty with magic while simultaneously preserving its commentary on systemic control. Cinderella's perseverance, while morally lauded, is rendered necessary by structural constraints rather than individual virtue alone. Her suffering, then, is not simply a plot device but a mirror of historical conditions in which gender, class, and family structures intersected to enforce subordination and limit opportunity. Cinderella's interactions with the broader social world, particularly the prince and the court, further under the story's engagement with power and coercion. The prince, while celebrated as a romantic hero, embodies the authority of the system itself. His selection of Cinderella is not solely a reward for virtue, but a demonstration of control, surveillance, and selective validation. The glass slipper trial exemplifies this dynamic, transforming an act of recognition into an exercise of power. Cinderella's body, her comportment, and her compliance are all evaluated according to criteria external to her will, revealing the intersection of desire and domination. The narrative thus encodes an enduring lesson. Elevation and recognition within hierarchical systems are often conditional, mediated by authority, and dependent upon compliance with socially imposed expectations. The motif of magical intervention, often celebrated as whimsical fantasy, also conveys symbolic meaning. The fairy godmother's transformations, the carriage, and the gown enable Cinderella to navigate spaces from which she is ordinarily excluded, reflecting the historically contingent nature of opportunity for marginalized individuals. However, these interventions are temporary, conditional, and externally imposed, reinforcing the precariousness of social mobility. The narrative dramatizes the tension between liberation and constraint, offering a momentary vision of agency while leaving the underlying structures of subjugation intact. The magic is both liberating and illusory, a metaphor for the selective, contingent, and mediated avenues of advancement available within stratified societies. Equally significant is the role of disguise and performance within the story. Cinderella's transformation into a figure recognizable to the elite illustrates the historical importance of social presentation. Clothing, comportment, and adherence to norms were crucial determinants of recognition and opportunity. Cinderella's magical attire allows her to navigate these social structures temporarily, highlighting the extent to which external appearance and conformity were, and remain, determinants of mobility within hierarchical systems. The story thus encodes lessons about the conditionality of opportunity, the performance of social identity, and the fragile balance between visibility and vulnerability. The narrative's conclusion, framed in popular culture as "happily ever after," merits particular scrutiny. While audiences are invited to celebrate Cinderella's ascent, the story simultaneously reinforces cycles of dependency and restricted agency. Her elevation is contingent upon adherence to norms, compliance with authority, and validation by those in power. The prince, the court, and the social structures that once constrained her continue to define the parameters of her autonomy. Historical analogues reinforce this interpretation. Women who experienced upward mobility through marriage or patronage often encountered new forms of oversight and limitation, reflecting a continuity of structural dependence rather than unmediated freedom. Cinderella's triumph, while materially rewarding, is thus both liberating and constraining, illustrating the ambivalence of empowerment within hierarchical systems. Modern adaptations have largely obscured these complexities. The Disney narrative, among others, emphasizes individual virtue, magical intervention, and romantic fulfillment while removing the darker elements of oppression, surveillance, and conditional recognition. Stepsisters are rendered comically cruel rather than systemically empowered. The glass slipper is transformed from a tool of evaluation into a charming plot device, and the prince is presented as a benevolent, romantic figure rather than a symbol of authority and control. The consequences of this sanitization are significant. Audiences internalize narratives of meritocratic triumph, magical resolution, and romantic reward while remaining largely unaware of the structural and historical forces that originally shaped the story. Cultural understanding is thus shaped by a version of the tale that prioritizes emotional gratification over historical consciousness, entertainment over systemic critique. The loss of historical nuance in modern retellings obscures essential lessons about gender, class, and morality. Early versions of Cinderella, with their emphasis on labor, subjugation, coercion, and conditional opportunity, provide insight into the mechanics of social control and the vulnerability of marginalized individuals. Sanitized narratives, by contrast, present a universe in which virtue and patience are sufficient to overcome structural barriers, masking the complexities of systemic oppression. This reframing influences perceptions of morality, reinforcing ideals of patience, compliance, and passive endurance as pathways to reward while minimizing engagement with structural inequities. The consequences extend beyond narrative. They shape cultural understandings of gender roles, social mobility, and the conditions of human agency. Re-examining Cinderella through the lens of history and structural analysis also deepens our understanding of power and authority. The story encodes lessons about surveillance, measurement, and evaluation, particularly as they relate to gender and vulnerability. The glass slipper serves as a concentrated symbol of these dynamics. It embodies fragility, precision, and conditional recognition, highlighting the ways in which authority is enacted through inspection, verification, and control. The slipper's symbolic resonance extends beyond the narrative, offering insight into the mechanisms by which hierarchical societies have historically regulated bodies, behavior, and opportunity. Recognizing this dimension transforms our interpretation of Cinderella from a simple story of romantic triumph into a commentary on the systemic exercise of power. Furthermore, the narrative illustrates the tension between hope and structural constraint. Magic, disguise, and eventual recognition offer the illusion of liberation, yet each is mediated by external authority, social norms, and compliance. This tension reflects historical realities. Individuals marginalized by class, gender, or social position have historically encountered opportunities that were provisional, contingent, and circumscribed by systems of power. Cinderella's journey dramatizes this conditionality, allowing audiences to experience the thrill of ascension while simultaneously highlighting the fragility and precarity inherent in systemic hierarchies. The story thus communicates lessons about vigilance, negotiation, and the complex interplay between personal agency and social structure. The tale also invites reflection on cultural memory and the shaping of perception. By examining the original narratives alongside modern adaptations, it becomes evident that stories are not merely entertainment. They are vehicles for encoding values, norms, and structural understandings. Sanitization erases uncomfortable truths about oppression, coercion, and systemic control, creating a cultural lens that emphasizes simplicity, moral clarity, and emotional satisfaction. In contrast, historical readings of Cinderella reveal complexity, tension, and ambiguity, providing insight into the lived realities of marginalized individuals and the mechanisms by which authority and hierarchy were maintained. Understanding these dimensions alters our engagement with the story, transforming it from a tale of simple triumph into a rich text of social commentary. Ultimately, revealing the dark truth within Cinderella reshapes the way we view the story and its legacy. The narrative, when fully contextualized, offers insight into the fragility of social mobility, the conditionality of recognition, and the persistence of systemic control over marginalized individuals. The glass slipper emerges not merely as a symbol of magical destiny or romantic fulfillment, but as a concentrated emblem of fragility, surveillance, and social coercion. The tale's enduring appeal lies in its enchantment, yet its historical and symbolic depth reveals lessons about power, gender, class, and agency that remain relevant today. By recognizing these layers, audiences gain a fuller appreciation for the story's complexity, the ethical questions it raises, and the social realities it mirrors. Cinderella, in its original form, is not simply a narrative of virtue rewarded or magic realized. It is a reflection of hierarchical authority, systemic oppression, and the conditional nature of opportunity. The journey from subjugation to recognition is mediated by external authority, magical intervention, and strict adherence to prescribed norms. Even the triumphs celebrated in modern adaptations are imbued with conditionality, dependence, and ongoing structural oversight. By restoring attention to these darker truths, we reframe the narrative not as an uncomplicated tale of happiness, but as a historical and cultural document that communicates enduring lessons about power, compliance, and vulnerability. In conclusion, the story of Cinderella, far from being a simple fairy tale, embodies a complex interplay of oppression, systemic control, and conditional recognition. From her suffering under the stepfamily to her magical transformation, the glass slipper trial, and her happily ever after, each element reflects historical realities of hierarchy, gendered vulnerability, and social negotiation. Modern adaptations, while entertaining and culturally significant, often obscure these truths, offering emotional gratification at the expense of historical and ethical depth. Understanding the dark truth hidden in Cinderella's glass slipper challenges audiences to reconsider the story's legacy, revealing the nuanced and often unsettling dynamics of power, agency, and social expectation embedded within this timeless narrative. By examining these layers, we gain not only a richer appreciation of the tale itself, but also critical insight into the historical and cultural forces that continue to shape storytelling, perception, and societal understanding.